Julia, thank you so much for coming to Memorial Woodlands tonight. We're really pleased to have you here. And you need no introduction, but you've got a great expertise in grief and bereavement, and you're a best-selling author. And so we will be talking about the books particularly covering bereavement, which are Grief Works, which is your first book, and Every Family Has a Story. But first I'd like to turn around to you, and if you could help us understand what people need when they are facing loss.
It's really lovely to be here. Gosh, there are so many things that people need. I think one of the things that people need is knowledge, which is why, I write my books, and evenings like this are important, because I think most people, when they are bereaved, feel that they're going mad, that they have all of this cocktail of conflicting feelings of being angry and sad and despairing and numb, and it is not a tidy kind of easy way of understanding yourself. And I think people often think they're doing it mad, that they're going mad, and everybody else is kind of sorted. So I think grief is a very small word that describes a world of messy and chaotic feelings. And although we're very bad at talking about death, I actually think we talk about death more than we talk about the fact that every single one of us is going to be bereaved. We will all have someone in our life that dies, and the task of grief is to find a way of facing the reality of the death of this person that we love. And a simple and maybe not entirely accurate measure of it is that the more significant they are in your life, the more you love them, or the more they have been invested in your life, the greater your level of loss. And that the task of mourning is to learn to adapt and live without them, to face that reality. And unfortunately, we are wired, the only way we learn is through pain, that pain is the agent of change. It's by having a memory, say, of a funeral, or of seeing the person as they're dying and when they've died, that lets us know that in a way that we can't not know that this person is dead, they irreversibly have died. Because our brain is a learning machine, but one of the ways that we survive in life is by trusting that the people that we love, when they walk out the door, that they're going to come back. And so we have to relearn when they've died that they're not going to come back. So you all know that kind of theory of John Bowlby and secure attachment, that we trust that love is predictable, and that loss, we need to kind of learn that no, they're not going to walk through the door. And so pain gives us the emotion that is meant to travel through our bodies to give us the information, this person has died. And every time we do it, we adjust a little bit more until we kind of do know it, and we learn to live with it. We don't get over it, we don't forget and move on, we accommodate and learn to live with this new fact that the person has died. And of course the other task, if you like, is facing the reality that they've died, but also that our relationship with them, our love with them, never dies. So finding ways of continuing that relationship, what Phyllis Silverman calls continuing bonds, so that the relationship continues. And we do that through kind of touchstones of memory. Things like your walks that you're going to be doing is a way of walking and talking and remembering the person that died that is very healing.
It's interesting because actually some of the early therapeutic work was about actually you're meant to sever that bond. Was it Freud who first said you're meant to sever that bond? But actually all the newest information is that it's about continuing bonds. And I'm just wondering, how do you help people move from I'm in such terrible pain about this person not walking through the door anymore, I just want them back, to that adaptation, that I'm aware they're not here and I still have this relationship with them which is different?
I mean, I think part of it is not trying to shift them from their pain. So, you know, one of the first questions I'm ever asked, as I'm sure you are, when someone walks through my door when they're grieving is, how long is it going to be? When is it over? When am I going to be okay again? You know, I find this pain unbearable.
Mm.
And my answer is, it will always take longer than you want, and there isn't a kind of fixed time frame. But I think what's useful is to think about it from kind of different perspectives. So there's two words for time in Greek. There's chronos time, which is chronological time, and kairos time, which is felt time. And actually in grieving, each of us will have our own subjective time frame of how we learn to adapt and accommodate and learn to live without this person that we love. And that will be informed by many aspects of ourselves. So it will be informed by our genetics, our personality type, our history of losses. A new loss will always bring back previous losses. If we've had a lot of traumatic losses, our capacity to manage this new loss is kind of narrowed. The circumstances of the death, how the person died, our relationship with the person that died, was it conflicted, was it a good relationship, did we get the opportunity to say goodbye, all of those things. And the biggest single predictor of our outcomes is the love and support that we get at the time and after the death. And my big cry for people who are grieving is that when we are bereaved, how we manage our lives needs to be paved with the love and connection of people. Mm. And that when love dies, it's the love of other people that enable us to survive.
So I just want to quote one of the many quotes that I picked up from your book. So I reread Grief Works and found it really fascinating. So it's a book where you have a number of people's stories. I don't want to call them case studies because they're very much people's stories, and the way you describe the stories. But in both books, you really talk about, one case study in Every Family Has a Story. You talk about how, it's in Peckham, I think, and there's a green sofa, and the grandmother is there in her lovely navy outfit, and it's really lovely because we feel like we're nearly there, and so it's not just a case study, it's a proper we're in with you. But in Grief Works, one of the first quotes that I picked up was, "Grief is profoundly misunderstood. It is so frightening, even alien. For many of us, that we cannot find the words to voice it. This silence leads to an ignorance that can prevent us from responding to grief, both in ourselves and in others." And the first thing that I would pick up from that is this experience that most people have, and you're saying it's so important that we are supported and have love, but a lot of people's experience is actually one where they're, that example where somebody crosses the road, and probably because they're not comfortable with it. So do you want to tell us a little bit more about how we manage that situation, and why people do it, and how can we help people create more of a sense of love and support?
I mean, I think there are, there's so many things from what you've said. I think, first of all, our fear of death comes from this kind of magical thinking that if I don't think about it and if I don't talk about it, somehow it's not going to happen to me. And that if I do face my own mortality or the mortality of the people I love most in the world, somehow I will hasten their death. And so I'm going to kind of leave it to one side. And of course that ignorance, where you have space, as all of you will know, you have imagination. And imagination about the unknown is very rarely positive, happy things. It's normally scary, frightening things. So we feel ignorance with a limitless story that we can tell ourselves and frighten ourselves with. But also one of the kind of, I think, ghosts from the past is this idea that we can fix people. And we can't fix people. So when someone is grieving, when people cross the road or change the aisle in the supermarket, it's because they get this kind of kick of fear of like, I don't know what to say, I can't make them better, and so I'm going to leg it. And actually, the fear is also because it means they face their mortality as well, and also they face someone who is suffering, and grief and any difficult feelings and positive ones are contagious. So it kind of puts us in touch with so much stuff that we find kind of scary and difficult. But if only people really fully trusted that all you have to say is, I'm so sorry, and the name of the person that's died, and acknowledge it, and job done. You can't fix this other person. The worst thing has happened, but you can make it worse by stepping away, by not being supportive. And also, every person knows their level of relationship. If you hardly know this person, they're not going to want you to be the person to fix them, because they want the people that know them and love them to do that. So it is just a kind of kindness to acknowledge it. Because otherwise, grieving people feel like, often I have people come into my room and they say, I feel like I'm some contagious disease that people have to kind of move away from. And it's the opposite that you need. And I think one of the things that I've often thought about is, Queen Victoria was the poster woman for grief. She wore black until she died, after Prince Albert died. And the Victorians were brilliant at showing that we're suffering, and they had black and grey and then purple mourning clothes and lots of mourning jewellery. And all we need is a little black ribbon or a black armband when we go out, so people know, like, treat me kindly, be a bit gentle with me. I've left my wallet behind. Don't scream at me because you're impatient, but you can see that I'm literally a bit bonkers right now because I'm grieving. And so I think there's even small symbols that help us recognise that grief is going to be part of everybody's life, as death is, and that we normalise it as much, and that we should be talking about this not as much as love and birth, but I mean, death and birth are interconnected. Dying and loving are interconnected, and they're two parts of the same coin. And so we need to kind of build the bridges of communication and understanding between them, rather than kind of hiving them off, hoping that it's going to be nothing to do with us.
And because there's this other myth that's out there and you quote it in your books as well. It's like, aren't they doing well? Aren't they doing well? They're so brave, and this, we don't want to, as a society, we don't want it to continue, and this myth that 3 months on somehow you need to be better. But a lot of the stories you have in a book, people come to you. I'm thinking about Cheryl in Every Family Has a Story, who lost her mother 2 years before coming to you, and she comes to you with quite a lot of pain. And I mean, do you want to tell us a little bit more about Cheryl, maybe?
Yeah, so I think one of my kind of messages, and I'd love to know what you all think, is that the things that we do to block the pain of grief is over time the thing that does us harm, and actually often does us harm through the generations, because those coping mechanisms, the things that we use to anaesthetise the pain, we model to our children, and so they learn them too. And with Cheryl, she'd had a difficult relationship with her mum. I mean, her mum was from the Caribbean and had come here and had a difficult early life, and had lots of things that she had to contend with. And so she was sometimes impatient with her daughter, and she really wanted her daughter to be educated and to be okay and get on, and didn't have a lot of time to kind of be soft and gentle. And Cheryl was always a bit frightened of her mum. And so in some ways she'd also inherited her mum's coping mechanism, which was to cut off. So she worked in a hospital, and in a paediatric ward actually, and so she got very busy. I mean, I think busyness is one of the key anaesthetics. Of course there's drug and alcohol and all the other things, but busyness is certainly my go-to when when I'm kind of very stressed out, which is always a sign for me, like I slow down and stop getting so busy. But with Cheryl, she shouted at a child in hospital like 2 years after her mum had died, and she knew that that wasn't really her. So she'd, you know, if you have joy one end and pain the other end, if you block the pain, you also block your capacity to feel joy, because your emotional bandwidth can't choose what it's feeling. So your capacity to feel is foreshortened, but also your capacity to regulate and manage your feelings is narrowed as well. So it's like you've had layers of skin taken off. You're much more impatient. You're much more. It's like there's a fire alarm in your head that goes off much quicker. You're much easily triggered. And so she realised that that was a signal she needed to get support. And the thing that we did was unpack her relationship with her mother, because in some ways the block was grieving the mother she wanted her to be. And often, you know, I'm not the mother my children would ideally choose. I mean, there's always lots of stuff that as parents our children need to kind of grieve for as a living loss. And also she had to learn new coping mechanisms. And the thing that she used to connect to her mum was, I asked her to bring in something, a touchstone to the memory of her mum, and I asked her to bring in something, and she brought in her mum's scarf, and she smelt the scarf, and it still smelled of her mum. And our neural networks, our smell is one of the fastest ones that completely short circuits our capacity to think or block our feelings, and that flooded her and in a way allowed her to feel the loss for her mum. And once she could access the sadness for her mum, she could also access her love for her mum. So her relationship with her mum was completely changed. And I think that's what's really important in grieving, is that our relationship with the person that's died continues and changes as we grow and change. And this idea that we're fixed, or that something is sorted and you can close it down in a file. But as human beings, we don't operate like robots. We are ongoing, adaptive beings that are influenced all the time, and we rework our memories. You know, they have different meaning for us. You know, smelling. So someone I'm working with right now, she uses her mum's cooking. So her mum, she's Indian, and her mum did an amazing curry. So every Sunday at the moment, she cooks her mum's curry, and that completely floods her with lots of lovely memories. And sometimes it makes her furious, and she sort of bashes the dishes when she's washing them up. And sometimes she's just really happy and remembers really happy meals with her mum. And so you can't predict what you're going to feel, but what you do want to do is feel.
Yeah, and I think that's very much one of the leitmotifs out of all those two books is actually, you know, it's really important to connect to our emotions and to connect to pain, and we can't block it out, because actually that is just going to make things worse. And as human beings, we just would like not to feel pain, and we don't really want to go there. But what you're really saying is you need to go there. You have to go there to kind of move on.
And I'm also, what I hope I'm saying is that we can develop coping mechanisms that give us some sense of agency. Of course, certainly at the beginning, when we're very raw, when we're grieving, we'll get flooded and hit with a wave of grief. Of course we will. But I think this idea that we just have to be fixed in one state is very unhelpful. So the model of theory of grief theory that I think is the most helpful is the dual process. I'm sure you all know Strobe and Shoot. So you have loss orientation, where you emote and grieve and feel your pain, and restoration orientation, where you have hope for the future, you get on with tasks, and you kind of have a break from the pain, and you're okay. And that the process of grieving is the oscillation, the movement between the two. So if you give yourself opportunities by journaling, by talking to a friend, by cooking your mum's favourite meal, to feel and be in relationship with your mum, then that can free you then to have restoration where you can go to work, you can get jobs done, you can be okay and move between the two. And I think one of the kind of misunderstandings about the stiff upper lip is that we need a stiff upper lip. I don't want everyone weeping everywhere and telling everyone what they feel. We do not need promiscuous emotional liberation all over the place. But what we want is that we have a way of coping in a stiff upper lip in places where it's not safe to be emotionally open. So that when we do go, I mean, if we go into work and we have a very kind of, we don't have a close relationship with a lot of the people, that we can function at work and in places that we need to function. And then at home, we can remove our stiff upper lip, talk to each other, have intimate, open, full emotional conversations, and have a break from them too, so that we can kind of be in touch with ourselves. But I think this idea that you're either all on or all off is what is very misunderstood. And actually, you talking about grief walks, I do think as families, one of the most useful ways of having emotional conversations is walking and talking, where the movement of your body opens up thoughts in your mind. By being outside in nature, we know is curative. You're not eyeballing each other. If you ask anyone how do they feel, they want to punch your lights out. So if you just kind of allow yourself to kind of say something, and then you have silence and somebody will say something else, then you can have very full conversations that can take only half an hour, and then go and have a pizza and have some fun. That's probably incredibly therapeutic. Or like the children in the back of the car, you know, telling you things. It's when you're forcing it that it becomes very, I think, very unhelpful. And just one last thing to say, I'm sorry I'm banging on, is that I also think what I talked a lot about in Every Family Has a Story is that big traumatic events, like suicides, like, you know, people killed in the war, all sorts of things, the generation that didn't allow themselves to grieve, they passed down the patterns both behaviourally and epigenetically to the next generation until someone's prepared to feel the pain. And I think that is something that we really need to look at. And of course, it wouldn't be everybody, because nothing is for sure, and trauma is only for sort of 15% of the population. Even traumatic events, a lot of people will naturally adapt. But when you're working with families or thinking about your own family, one of the things people say is, you know, it didn't start with me. I don't know why I was born. I was born so sensitive and hypersensitive to cars backfiring, and I have surges of fear, but nothing's happened to me. It might well be that the cortisol levels in your body are heightened by trauma that happened to your grandmother in the war.
And in Every Family Has a Story, you talk about the Rossi family, don't you? So the Rossi, it's 3 daughters and the mother whose husband committed suicide. And you know, the way you write it, we really feel the trauma for that family, and those are kind of very complex grief situations, and a couple of things that you've mentioned in terms of how everybody is coping in the different generations around grief. But maybe, you know, you can tell us a little bit more about that family and what came out and how they were able to cope. One of what you said earlier on about how you cope with a story at different times. And again, I'm thinking about children and how children are helped to deal with grief.
I mean, there's a lot to say. So the Rossi family were a family of 3 daughters in sort of from 38 to 45. And 40 years before their dad had killed themselves. And one of the things about trauma is that it's in the amygdala, it's in the kind of very primitive part of the brain where the past becomes the present. So this cluster bomb that kind of threw shards into all the members of the family was as present in them 40 years later as it had been the day he died by suicide. And what was very sort of difficult and complicated was, because they were all traumatized, their coping mechanisms were to block the pain, and they all had a different story and a kind of unheard story from each other. So, and the mum was angry and frightened and kind of had a thin layer of she lost it a lot. And so why they came to see me was that they said, "Mum, we're tired of you having tantrums," is what they said. And we're middle-aged now, we've got our own children, and we want it to be different. And she was incredibly courageous to come. And one of the big things that I was able to do in working with the four of them was they heard each other's stories and the pieces of the story that had been missing, and unearthed memories that had bothered them, so that they had a coherent narrative together. And often in family systems, people compete to have the right story, because they want to be the one that knows the story, or everyone else is wrong. And I think what is incredibly powerful about family therapy is that when you expand your story to have a full narrative of everyone's story being included, then as a family you have a basis of which to understand and connect each other that is much, much stronger, has much stronger roots. But also, it changed their relationship with their dad, because one of the things that came up was the eldest daughter said, everybody always says how marvellous Dad was. He was so funny, he was such a great man. They didn't say that he was an alcoholic that killed himself. and she's right, that people want to protect children, and they want to protect themselves from the brutality of suicide. And when we talked about their dad, and they were able to talk about their dad fully, they had a bigger understanding of his story. And then I asked them to write him a letter, or do a kind of mood board, or do something to remember him. And they were all like horrified, like, no, I barely knew him. And one of the daughters was 3, and she said, I was only 3 when he died, and he spent all of my life drunk, and I wasn't enough for him to live. And so that was the kind of shard of the cluster bomb that had sat in her. And the mother said, I never dared ask how it was for you. And that's the terrible difficulty. As a mother, it is unbearable to see your children suffer when there's nothing you can do to protect them. But for the children, not to be able to name their suffering means they carry it alone. And so the power of our conversations was that they recognized that they could feel this pain. The pain did not kill them, but actually it released them. And they could have much more compassion for themselves and for each other by facing the truth. And one of the cruelties of suicide, and actually a lot of death, is that people turn against themselves with that litany of what ifs, if onlys, why didn't I, wasn't I enough, even if I was 3. And there's the mother, somehow I failed, I picked the wrong dad, or but when you can have self-compassion, then you change your story for yourself, you change your story for your family, and when your story changes, your life changes, your outcomes change.
And I just want to pick up a quote that you mentioned about this family, which is quite difficult, so brace yourselves. That suicide is like a cluster bomb. The shard pierces those closest to it, living inside them in the form of grief and trauma until such a time as they are located and the injury addressed. Guilt and the repeated what if and why are but a few of the agonies survivors contend with. It is very painful, and I a couple of years ago, just before COVID, I supported a young mother with children whose husband had committed suicide, and it's an incredible pain that you witness. And now I'm thinking about professionals who have to deal with supporting that, and I'm kind of turning around to you, and it's really nice actually how in your books you talk about how difficult it is for you, how you feel the sense of the pain and how that affects you. And I think we have to be mindful of ourselves as professionals when we're supporting other people. And I'm just wondering if you've got some advice about how do you deal with that sense, that difficulty. I'm also thinking that there's another person you supported for quite a long time, whose sister was dying.
Oh
Yeah, and Fazia, yeah. When we work for a long time, so I remember working for a year with a family, and it made me feel better when I read you that you cry, because I cry. And sometimes there's that sense that, you know, as a therapist or as a professional, you know, when we're meant to be coping by not emoting, which seems crazy, because how can we be compassionate if we're not feeling it? But how do you cope with that, and how would you suggest, you know, professionals deal with that that compassionate side that actually makes us hurt as well?
I mean, I think you know, the idea of those in the helping professions often get there because of something significant in their own lives. So on the one hand, I think, you know, helping others helps us. You know, all the research shows that helping other people is as good for the people who are helping as it is for the people receiving it. So that we, you know, I feel very lucky to do a job that I love, and that gives me so much, the connection, the knowledge, the meaning. So that is an incredibly kind of vital part of it, that meets needs in me. I don't really like the idea of altruism, that you're doing something for other people. I do think I'm doing it for me, and for me the big thing I get from it is the level of the connection with someone, that often the kind of intimacy and the closeness that I create in relationships is very profound for me. And of course it means that, you know, I for 34 years have heard every single way someone can die, and so that my lens of life is distorted, you know, particularly children and babies dying, and so it changes the fire alarm in my head. So if my grandchildren have a headache, I think they have a brain tumour, or I chop grapes unbelievably small, and I drive my children mad when my grandchildren are on bicycles, because I'm like this all of the time. So it affects. I see danger everywhere, and the thing I do to stabilise myself is I kickbox. So because I have to be sort of patient and nice in my job, I punch someone's lights out every single week, and he can't believe how much I want to hurt him. And I take a lot of exercise, and I only watch happy things on television. I drive my husband mad if I walk out of the room if it's scary or sad. So, you know, I think the basic thing is that the input that I get of stories, I have to find a way of releasing it, and then get positive input by doing a lot of things that are joyful. Nature is hugely healing for me. But fundamentally, I have got so much more from doing my job than I have ever given. So it's and yeah, you get bad dreams too. I just don't think anyone can do this job and be mechanistic. You have to be able to have the emotions be contagious and use them in the benefit of the client to understand what's going on.
It's interesting because the kind of the top tips that you just gave us in terms of exercising, and it's kind of in your Grief Works book you talk about a package of techniques which I quite like. So you say 10 minutes writing in a journal about everything that's swirling around inside you, then 20 minutes of running, 10 minutes of meditating, 20 minutes of watching or reading something funny.
That's if you're angry. So that anger, so people talk about, the research shows that if you're really, really angry, venting makes you more angry. But naming your anger, running your anger off, so the cortisol levels, so if you take exercise, the cortisol levels drop and your oxytocin increases because you've told your body you've flown, you're not in fight flight anymore, so you're back in safety. So always we want to kind of find a way of allowing ourselves to go up in response to the danger and find a way of expressing it and releasing it, but regulating back that I'm home, I'm safe in my mind, safe in my body, safe around my kitchen table. And with anger, the thing that switches you from anger, that ruminating, that, oh, I hate you so much, is humour. You can't be angry and laugh at the same time. At the moment, for me, it's Gogglebox. For a while, it was Modern Family. Sometimes it's Schitt's Creek. Obviously, I have a very high bar of what I watch. But they all work for me, and they're short, and they're funny.
Yeah, no, they sound like really great examples. The one thing that I also wanted to talk about is children and how we talk to children. And I think we're getting better, but there's still this feeling in society, in many, that, you know, you mustn't upset them, it's not appropriate for them to be involved, and, you know, I would like you to bust that myth as much as you can.
So I think we very naturally want to protect children from suffering, and partly it's because we believe quite rightly that they need to be innocent and not see difficult and painful things, and partly because we find it unbearable to see them suffer. So it's both things. But we know from research, and I think we all know kind of instinctively, that children need the same truth as the adults around them, and that when we protect children by not giving them the truth and giving them the same information as we have, we actually exclude them. And again, what children don't know, they make up, and what they make up is much more frightening than the truth. And, you know, I remember someone saying to me, it was a paediatric nurse, is if you're going to start fooling a section of the population, don't start with the under fours. Children pick up everything. They'll pick up the mood, they'll pick up lots of people in the house, they'll pick up that you're crying. And if they don't know what the underlying reason is, they will begin to think there's something that they've done wrong, and they will turn that against themselves. And the other thing is, particularly now with social media, of course, but I think anyway, they will learn the truth from somebody else. And if you haven't told them the truth as their most important, significant person in their life, how are they going to trust you? So you will break a fundamental bond of trust with your child if you don't tell them the truth. You know, my childhood, one of the significant reasons I'm a therapist is because both my father and my mother were very, very significantly bereaved. My mum, her mother, her father, her sister and her brother were all traumatically died and killed in the war by the time she was 25, and my dad, his father and his brother the same. And they never talked about them, and things were clearly not okay, but they always said everything was fine, and they talked about everything that didn't matter and nothing that mattered. They literally, I never knew what on earth was going on, and there's no doubt that as, you know, it influenced me to be a therapist because I wanted to know what was going on inside people, because I couldn't make it out from what they were saying or what they were showing. And I think all children are detectives. They pick up stuff, and they need a coherent narrative, again, every piece of the jigsaw, to make sense of their experience, what they witness, what they hear, and what they know.
Thank you. The last question I want you to kind of help with is, what can friends and family do to help somebody who's experiencing grief?
I mean, you know, it's enormous what friends and family can do. I guess the first thing is to recognise that they can't fix the person who's bereaved, and that they can support the person that's bereaved. And that support comes in a multitude of ways and will be different for each person and for their relationship. You know, so if you're someone who isn't a very good listener, bringing lasagna or taking the children to the park or offering to do things, do shopping for you, that is a really good thing to do. If you're a good listener, bring soup, sit down and listen. People need all sorts of different things, and they can be from different people. But fundamentally what they need is your capacity to be present in their life, to ask and not tell. Like, tell me, what do you need? You don't have to know. You don't have to be a mind reader. Do you want to talk? How can I help you? And texts are good, but texts are helpful, but they can be unbelievably unhelpful. So one of the things that people can do is try and get in the mindset of the other person, not your mindset. So, you know, I often hear these stories of this friend said to me, I'm going to take you on holiday because you need a holiday. And she said, the last thing in the world I want is a holiday. But it distorts the friendship because you feel so profoundly misunderstood and so profoundly not seen as you are. And you think, you know, what is it about that? So it can change the relationship. So the main thing is to say, what can I do? How can I help? And listen to the answer and respond to what you're told.
And follow through.
And that love, you know, if there's one thing that makes a difference for someone who is grieving, is the love of others. You know, that is the big, big thing. However you give love. Love in action, love sometimes in stepping back, love in going forward, letting go. But love in all its different forms is what matters.
And that kind of links beautifully to the first quote in your Grief Works book, which says, there is no love without pain, but only love can heal that pain which it causes. Thank you so much, Julia. Thank you.